Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Emma Lane. I'm a member of the Just and Inclusive Economics team here at Ceres. Today, we have a great program to share with you. It will be centered on the Inflation Reduction Act with a focus on climate justice and the ways in which organizations such as Ceres can help to ensure the success of this bill. I'm very pleased to welcome two of our esteemed guests today, Director Jacqui Patterson of the Chisholm Legacy Project, and the newest member of our Ceres Board of Directors, which we are thrilled about, and joined by Dr. Robbie Luckett of Jackson State University in Mississippi. Today's panel will be hosted by Richard Zhuang. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to our guests to introduce themselves. A very warm welcome to you both. Director Patterson, please begin.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the welcome, Anne. So yes, my name is Jacqui Patterson. I am the Executive Director of the Chisholm Legacy Project, and our tagline is a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Director Patterson, for joining us today. Dr. Luckett, please introduce yourself.
Allowing me to be a part of this conversation. It's my great privilege to be here. My name's Robbie Luckett. I am a professor of history at Jackson State University, where I've been on the faculty for 14 years. My specialty is civil rights movement history in Mississippi. I'm not an environmental historian, but I do study social justice movements, particularly in Mississippi and African American history. And in addition to that, I'm director of the Margaret Walker Center, which is a Black Studies Institute that was founded by the great writer and scholar Margaret Walker in 1968. And we continue to lift up her academic, artistic, and activist legacy as a Black Studies Research Center, archive, and museum dedicated to the African American experience. So, and I'm in Jackson, Mississippi. And if you've been paying attention to the news in and around Jackson in recent months, you know that we've been at the heart of a major water crisis. So I'm happy to be here to shed, I guess, some light, hopefully historically, on kind of what that means for this city and for the people who live here.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Luckett. We are so pleased to have you both joining us today. And Richard, please introduce yourself and then lead us into the panel.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's a real pleasure to be here. And let me underscore, Director Patterson, Dr. Luckett, it is an honor to have both of you here today in conversation with Ceres. I'm really excited for this conversation because this kind of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary conversation, I think, is critical for us at this moment in time. As you know, the Inflation Reduction Act is a sea change, you might say, in terms of the financial and political commitment to addressing climate change, to addressing the transition to renewable energy, and to funding environmental justice efforts. That said, I think it's important to put this moment in time, this sea change, in the broader context of a long history of environmental racism and economic injustice, the very core of what environmental justice seeks to address. So I'd like to open up this conversation to get both of your thoughts from your respective disciplinary perspectives on what is it that we need on the ground. What do you see as examples of environmentally overburdened communities or areas of environmental injustice that need this kind of funding and this kind of infusion of capital and of political will? I'm happy to lead off with either of you. Perhaps Director Patterson, you could start.
I was excited to see Robbie come off mute, but anyway, I will. So yes, thank you for that question. So I would say, so some of the issues that we need to see addressed, and I guess we'll explore further the extent to which the IRA will be successful in that, but is the pervasive and historic and unabated challenges in terms of environmental toxins that certain communities are exposed to, the lack of access to whether it's clean air, clean water, uncontaminated soils that certain communities historically and pervasively continue to experience, and the lack of infrastructure that the very same communities continue to be deprived of, and the differential vulnerability to the impacts of climate change that is on top of all of those things that and differentially affects the very same communities. So whether we're talking about communities that are more likely to be host to toxic facilities and toxic practices, whether it's at coal-fired power plants, oil and gas apparatus, near roadway air pollution, et cetera, whether it's communities that are more likely to be in floodplains and less likely to have flooding infrastructure, whether it's communities that are less likely to have access to livelihoods and economic wherewithal to be able to provide not only for themselves, but also to be able to have a local tax structure that can enable the local kind of basic services that people need, whether it's trash pickup or otherwise. So these are things that are in certain communities, we see them visibly, like what's happening in Jackson and in the news. But then we have the fact that there are scores of other communities that have been experiencing these quiet disasters, very, very loud for them, but invisible for the rest of us, just on a chronic basis. So those are the communities that we need to be starting with in terms of addressing these historic and pervasive challenges.
Really appreciate that last point you made there, Jacqui. You know, in the scholarship around the American South and Mississippi in particular, there's this notion of Southern exceptionalism, where the rest of America looks at the Deep South as that's the bad part of the nation, and like that's where everything just goes wrong. And it essentially allows the rest of this country historically off the hook for the pervasive discrimination that we see in backyards from coast to coast. It's what has happened in Mississippi is an American story. It's not just a Mississippi story. It's not just a Jackson story. Now, there is a Mississippi story, and I'm happy to talk about that and talk about what's happened here, especially in terms of the water. But the reality is what happened with this water crisis, people point to the flooding that we had several weeks ago that led to the failure of the water treatment plant and what causes that. Of course, that is a story of an environmental disaster created through climate change, and there's a bigger story there too. But historically and socially, let's look at the power structure in the state of Mississippi and what led to the problem, not just the environmental climate crisis that we're facing that leads to flooding and to these types of things, but the reality that people who have had power, the most power in the state of Mississippi, a state that is the blackest state in America, 37% African American, a city and a capital city in Jackson that's now over 80% African American, and yet a power structure that is predominated by particularly white conservatives who have been have had the lion's share of power in the state for the better part of 150 years. And the reality is that in the last 50 years in this city and in this state, since desegregation in particular, you have seen an increasingly hostile relationship between leadership at the highest levels and a Black capital city. And that has meant disinvestment in this capital city in terms of all kinds of social services, not just a water system that's over 100 years old, but in our schools and in healthcare and in access to all kinds of things that address issues of social inequality. And so there is a very kind of rich, direct history. I'm happy to talk more about specific to Mississippi, and it was what has led us to this point here. But I hope that through this, we can talk about perhaps Mississippi and Jackson and what we've faced here as a lens for exploring what is happening all over this nation in communities of color and disadvantaged communities everywhere. And the only other thing I would kind of say at this point that I'm sure we'll have some time to talk about too, there are also lessons here for how we address this. And if the civil rights movement in Mississippi can teach us anything, it's that there are real avenues for grassroots organizing and advancement and empowerment that can give us some hope for work. And the news that's been kind of out there around the water crisis in Jackson has been pretty doomsday. It's been, you would think Jackson was about to fall off the face of the earth into some kind of abyss, but we have a history and a tradition that is incredibly resilient and that is replete with lessons from grassroots organizers and activists for how we lift up our community and continue to survive and continue to be here and try to advance the lives of our entire community despite the odds that are stacked against us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Luckett, and thank you, Director Patterson. Let's stay at the ground level here, because I think we're following an important thread. From my perspective, working in policy, legislation is great. It's our bread and butter. But I'm also keenly conscious as an environmental activist that legislation is only as good as its implementation. So I'd like to pull up the slide with details of the Inflation Reduction Act, if I could. I'd like to perhaps have us do a bit of a thought experiment, staying at the ground level, talking about implementation, talking about concrete examples. So we would see, if we were to look at the Inflation Reduction Act, some really nice environmental justice funding, neighborhood access and equity for transportation, funding for pollution monitoring and for air pollution, block grants for community-based organizations, vast sums that dwarf any sums previously spent on environmental justice. But what will we do with it? I want to ask perhaps the both of you to do a bit of a thought experiment. If you could be in charge of the funds, how would you spend it? Where would you spend it? And in what order and would you spend it in? And also, what would you need other than money? I'm happy to, if either of you have an opening thought on that.
I'll jump in and take a stab. Look, I think what we have to have is, and this is kind of big picture, and I'll try and drill down a little bit too, a commitment from the federal government as it is enacting these efforts to ensure that these funds actually get spent on what they're supposed to be spent on. I can tell you in Mississippi, a lot of people are afraid of the word block grant. And it goes back to welfare reform, the other big topic that we're in the news right now about in Mississippi, and what has been exposed as a welfare fraud scheme in the, nearly $100 million of defrauding the poorest people in America, so that the wealthiest in this state can have pet projects like volleyball arenas on college campuses built with welfare funds. Welfare money comes to Mississippi in block grants too, and as it does to all states, and it's up to the states to distribute that money. The state of Mississippi has put so many barriers in place to that money. Less than 2% of applicants in Mississippi received TANF funds last year. It was only 200 families in the entire state received funds for welfare from TANF. If we're going to run by the same model, I don't have any hope that these funds will do the work that they are intended for. And so there needs to be, and you'll see this in commentary online as people are kind of reacting to this too. There needs to be a very serious commitment from the Biden administration and from the federal government to ensure that these block grants are actually spent on what they're supposed to be spent on: pollution monitoring, mitigating climate and health risk. I serve on the Board of Trustees of Jackson Public Schools. I see these things in our schools every single day. A school district whose infrastructure, we just passed a bond issue and have spent $70 million in our school district, but we've got 50 plus school buildings. $70 million is a fraction of what we really need to fix buildings that were built in the days when you had asbestos tiling throughout buildings. And so guaranteeing that money goes to the places it needs to go to. I look at something like the transportation grants too. That's wonderful, but also as a historian, let's look at the history of opposition from particularly white conservative states in the Deep South to expanding access to public transportation anywhere. We have terrible public transportation in the South, and that's a history of white supremacy, where people resisted expanding access to those forms of transportation. So where does the federal government step in and guarantee that these things are actually going to happen and be funded at the levels? It's nice to say that we've got however many hundreds of millions of dollars that are appropriated for these things, but we've got to do something to ensure that people of goodwill are out there guaranteeing that the funds are going to where they're supposed to be going to, and that they are actually invested in this project. So I'll stop with that thought. I got a couple others, but I don't want to get too carried away.
Director Patterson?
Yeah, I would just add to that in terms of those pathways to make sure that monies go where they're supposed to go. And that in some ways, when there's a label of disadvantaged communities, that even amongst disadvantaged communities, some of these programs tend to meet like the high level disadvantaged communities, the ones who have broadband, the ones who have already figured out how to access these extremely complicated processes for navigating the federal funding system. And so for me, a large priority needs to be on establishing pathways and establishing capacity building efforts for the federal agencies themselves to reach the communities. Because that's one thing that I've been hearing about recently in terms of efforts doing the capacity building for the communities to navigate these complex systems. Like, how about let's make those complex systems less complex so that people don't have to have a PhD in system navigation in order to get grants when they're already, drinking poison water and breathing poison air. And so that for me needs to be a priority, an investment in and of itself, an investment in making sure that the pathways are clear, and that a community, some of the communities we work with, there would have been no avenue whatsoever for them to hear that these things are even in existence. And those are the communities that we're fortunate enough to work with. And then there's the communities that have that we're not working with, that no one's working with, and just have and so there needs to be a mapping effort to make sure that we know where these communities are, and they need to start with those communities and work their way in. No notion of a rising tide lifting all boats when some folks aren't even in a boat in the first place. So this is whenever I'm asked anything in the universe of this question, regardless if it was a direct answer, I try to get it in because I feel so strongly about it. Thank you.
That certainly makes sense, and certainly deep need for capacity building and infrastructure building, community-based organizations that the government, frankly, is hoping will take up work of distributing and using these environmental justice funds. But what I'm hearing is the real risk of a disconnect between federal government and state government and the real frontline communities and communities that need this funding.
And I think that's exactly the point. And again, Jacqui made an excellent argument there for having systems that are accessible to the people who need it the most. And that's just a reality. These community organizations and the people who are doing this work at the grassroots level, they actually know what needs to be done. They know what the work is, and making sure that they've got access to these. We're going to have the systems and these funds. We're going to have people who are making sure that they've got access to these systems in ways that doesn't make this whole process impenetrable.
Well, so there's a third actor here, and that's kind of where Ceres is at, so to speak. The private sector. Does the private sector have a role in bridging this gap? Because Ceres, as you know, is focused on bringing private sector support to sustainability, to climate change efforts, and now environmental justice efforts. So what would you advise we tell our private sector partners in order to make sure these grants really get to where they need to go? Is there a role for the private sector in all of this, in addressing these problems?
I'm going to say yes, but I think it's Jacqui's turn to jump in.
Thank you. Say in a number of different ways. One, if the private sector has relationships in communities, really being a part of this Herculean effort that we need a much more commitment in terms of bridging community access to these resources, whether it's in whatever ways that's possible is certainly important. And then also leveraging new resources to complement and deepen investments so that we actually have transformational differences at the state and local level. So that's also critical as well. I mean, I think about places like Puerto Rico where the grid was decimated, and instead of building back better, there's a rebuild of the fossil fuel infrastructure. And so what role can private sector play in helping to build back in a way that's actually sustainable and helping to mitigate the private sector folks who actually advanced the proposal for a fossil fuel rebuild? So what can we do to help to marshal our colleagues in the private sector to not do that, and then also to leverage resources to build back fossil free, and that as given that as an example. So so those are a couple of things that I would say.
That makes sense.
And again, yes, there's absolutely an essential and important role for the private sector to play. Look, just in terms of what is very clearly in Mississippi, and this is from my very direct local kind of lens here, a disconnect between our city government in Jackson and our state government. These guys they just are at heads over what is going on with this water crisis. The capacity for the private sector to come in and bridge those divides and to help provide avenues for effective communication and dialogue that leads to some consensus and to some work. It's been successful in Mississippi before. We've seen this happen, and there certainly are opportunities for the private sector to come in to do this work. I was actually, the last few days, I've been in New Orleans at a convening held by the Kellogg Foundation, and we were having some of these conversations about this type of work and, looking at places like the Mississippi Delta, which is notorious as being one of the poorest places in the world, not just in America, but also the home of some of the most fertile soil in the world. And what are we doing as we're looking at farm crises all over this country, particularly in places like California, that's dealing with drought and fire and all of these major environmental concerns? What are we doing to think about the future of a place like the Mississippi Delta that has the capacity to really help transform farming in America and to lift it up and to make sure that it's accessible to the people who live there in terms of farm laborers, in terms of farm owners, and isn't completely absorbed into a corporate machinery that's already buying up chunks and chunks and chunks of acreages in places like that. So the private sector has a key role in bridging conversations here and to enabling work to go forward and to thinking equitably about what our future is around environmental justice in places like Mississippi.
And that makes a great deal of sense. Let me ask, let's pull down the slide. Let's turn our attention back to the speakers, and I'm happy to broaden the conversation as well as to dig more deeply into Mississippi and Jackson as concrete examples. It does seem to me that the private sector is often a mixed bag. Are there examples that we can think of, that you can think of, where the private sector has had a concrete positive impact? And what activities, what types of actions should the private sector be avoiding to avoid harm? Success stories and failures.
I was thinking about that. So one example of a positive is, I would say, the partnership between Microsoft and a group of environmental justice organizations, where Microsoft came to the environmental justice community broadly and said, we want to do better. Everything from making sure that we are recognizing that some of our data centers use as much energy as some small nations. They said that there's an opportunity there for them to invest in local communities and local groups that are generating clean energy so that they are not getting those resources from fossil fuel-based energy production. And so they were intentional about having a principle and a practice that follows sustainability principles and practices, both in terms of procuring from renewable energy sources, but also doing it in a way that's led by frontline communities. So not just kind of replacing kilowatt for kilowatt, but doing it in a way that infuses equity. And so, and more broadly, they took that as an entry point and then said, what are other ways that we can work with you as frontline communities on food and on water issues in the communities in which we are working as Microsoft. And so they have supported and resourced the development of this advisory group. They've called themselves Power Force, renewable energy sources, but also environmental justice groups, and they have now established an ongoing sustained relationship with them where it's not just kind of a light advisory group, but an actual decision-making group that they are taking heed from. So that is a positive example for sure. And it's nationally, in answer to Ann's question, it's actually in multiple places that they're doing this. And most recently, I know that there was some work in Atlanta with some groups there. But yeah, they're doing it nationally in multiple places. So thank you.
That's a wonderful example. And it does make me wonder, Dr. Luckett, is that something that could be translated to the Jackson or the broader Mississippi context?
Well, look, specific to Jackson, I think we're going to have some kind of private investment to ensure a long-term fix and sustainability of our water system. You know, this is not something that will be fixed in the next 6 months. We're talking about a system that has gotten to this point over the last 100 years. Our water system dates to 1920. And the type of investment that's going to be required and the long-term commitment. To think about our civil servants, even the ones who care the most about this work, they're not going to be around long enough to see it be fixed, because this is generational type work that's going to be required. And it's going to be the private sector and people in the private sector who are around for this long term. Our mayor is going to serve 1 term, 2 terms, 3 terms, but not 20 terms. And so it is absolutely something that could work in a place like Mississippi. And there also has to be some trust building between the private sector and the people of Mississippi, I think, to make it particularly effective, because what we have often seen are corporations who want to use Mississippi for its resources and its cheap labor. And that is a narrative that needs to be flipped on its head. And the private sector can come in and help us do that and recognize that there are benefits for doing business and working in places like Mississippi for their bottom line that increases justice and equity.
That makes sense. And in the light of both examples that have been offered, is there a set of policy proposals, a set of laws that you would want to put on the table to help foster sort of private-public collaboration to help ensure that money goes where it's best used and most needed? How would you fix it?
Going back to one of the first things I said is that whatever structures put in place to see these programs from the Inflation Reduction Act implemented, there needs to be structures to make sure that this money is properly spent and allocated to the places it's supposed to go, and that the people who are meant to benefit from it actually do and have some say and agency in this process. And so the policies in terms of simply the implementation and the delivery of the resources to these communities needs to be well thought out. And it can't just be, here, state of Mississippi, here's $500 million to go fix your problems, because that has proven not to work. And so there's got to be some real intentionality put to how this thing is carried out and how it works. And I'm not a policy wonk or an expert in any way, shape, or form. I'm just a historian. But from what we have seen, we know that we need that. We need very direct guidance from the federal government from that makes this actually work.
Yes, and to that end, I would say that we need a campaign finance reform so that we actually, because to Dr. Luckett's comment before, the communities know what's needed. And if communities were in real decision-making power, we would have a very different situation. How that we definitely need, and we need our private sector partners to back that. Right now, the corporatocracy isn't really working for anyone. And so we need that. And similarly, we need to make sure that we are putting, there's kind of big D democracy and then there's small D democracy. We need to make sure that even in some of these smaller offices, for example, even like FERC, for example, has now established its Office of Public Participation. And we need to make sure that the public participation isn't just people having a mic to speak to, but they're actually part of decision making. And similarly, we need to see more of those types of relationships so that zoning boards aren't making decisions and able to say, well, we put the notice, on page 53 in small print in the newspaper that no one reads, that we need to actually make sure that public participation and decision making is mandated and is resourced and is structural pervasively. So that would be some examples of what I would say needs to happen.
And that makes a great deal of sense. And the democracy piece does seem to me to be critically important. One of the important concepts, I think, that has been increasingly floated around in proposed legislation is that of meaningful public participation, as opposed to perfunctory or simply pro forma public participation. Because ultimately, if, as you say, if a community is not part of the decision-making process, simply expressing their opinions, but actually helping and shaping the decision, then you don't really have democracy. You basically have noblesse obligée or something along those lines. If you could speak to companies about democracy, I am curious, what would you say to them? What sort of things do you think the private sector should support to help have that effective democracy? Is it campaign finance reform, stronger requirements around public participation in regulatory processes? Is it redistricting? What would you want to tell companies?
Yes, to all of it. Look, I mean, we still in Mississippi have a state government and even local governments that operate under a lot of secrecy. We need more access, more openness. We need to know what's going on. The welfare scandal that happened, how does this happen where people can steal $90 million in welfare funds for the use of people who frankly don't need the money? They already got the money. They could spend their own money and build a $5 million volleyball stadium without even worrying about it. So we need those things. Campaign finance reform, absolutely. Interesting to that point, I see the question and the comments about where do we start? We start at kind of the small and build up, or do we start at the top and work down? I do think that the civil rights movement can be instructive to a certain extent in that regard, because where we've seen the greatest change is where change has fomented from the bottom up, and where our leaders are forced to respond to the demands of the people and to the communities that they're serving. Now, I do think there's a little bit to be said about the capacity to do both at the same time. I don't know that it has to be one or the other. I do think the private sector can start at the top. It can begin creating conversations, for instance, in improving the dialogue and communication between our state government and our city government here in Jackson, and play a very key role in saying, hey, we want to do business here. What do we have to do to get you guys to the table where we can have conversations that are actually beneficial to doing the business end of this work, while at the same time taking very seriously the comments and the concerns and the questions of the communities that you're hoping to do business in, and building that up. That it is possible to do both. But again, from a historical perspective of looking at the movement, we know that grassroots movement that come up to the top lead to greater change than anything that's trying to be implemented simply from the top down.
How critical is it to back up the asks with respect to private sector participation versus an appeal to the phrase I use, noblesse obligée? How strongly does the private sector have to come out and make its position known? how forceful do we need the private sector to be?
My own kind of personal experience and bias tells me that we can't depend on noblesse oblige, that we can't depend on kind of a notion of the trickle down effects of economics, right? That's a model that has proven to fail over and over and over again. And that we're just going to expect that the people who have are going to feel obligated, or we can make them come to the table here. I think that we do need people. I keep coming back to this notion of people who goodwill, who want to see this change come, and who realize that it can benefit a private sector at the same time as it benefits the broader public. And we need those people to be forceful in what they're asking.
We have begun urging electric utilities to take full advantage of the IRA, including the bonus credits for low-income community investment. Any advice how to maximize this opportunity? Maybe someone develops a leaders and laggards list to put pressure on them. So one of our major focuses here at Ceres is the transition to renewable energy across the nation, and utilities are, of course, central to that. One area which obviously is essential, environmental justice and to economic justice, is taking advantage of the incentives to invest in lower income communities, in disproportionately overburdened communities. How do you have any advice for our corporate partners in this work?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of a leaders and laggards list as kind of a way to inspire. And I think when inspiration fails, then another thing that we're actually working on, we're putting out a report. It's in its final stages of layout and design on the Public Utilities Commissions and the Public Service Commission. Actually, in Mississippi, there's a fellow there who has actually been a bit of a friend to some of the communities as it relates to advancing some more progressive, relatively progressive efforts within the PSC there. But we're doing a paper that really kind of calls out the lack of diversity in the leadership of the PUCs. Well, just taking Mississippi again as an example, that a state that's 37% African American in its 80+ year history of the Public Service Commission has never had an African American Public Service Commissioner. And so, but with that, looking at race, gender, because it's also a very gendered space as well, but also ties to industry and how industry ties have kind of chronically had an impact on the extent to which the PUCs and PSCs are actually working in the interest of the public versus working in the interest of the people. And so it's been a bit of a challenge in the past. And so we have seen where even Georgia, that doesn't have the best PSC in place, and some of the more progressive commissioner candidates haven't been successful in past years, like Blackman and most recently Chandra Farley. But they, at least when Georgia Power was proposing a 20 megawatt solar investment, they mandated that it be a 200 megawatt solar investment. And so there's an opportunity there to really, if the inspiration doesn't work with the leaders and laggards list, to start to actually, legislate or regulate and enforce some standards that are mandatory through the PUCs and the PSCs. So thank you.
Early on in this conversation, my work on the school board in Jackson, the 16th section land that we own in Jackson includes a major lake. It's a 50-acre lake that for the better part of the last 50, 60 years, Entergy has been using as a cooling pond. Now Entergy wants to pull out. They had a 50-year lease. And part of the lease agreement requires Entergy to remediate the lake to its original condition. Now, you can imagine what the condition of the lake and the soil and the sediment is after 50 years of being used as a cooling pond here in Jackson, in a neighborhood that is depressed, in a city that is depressed, right? But the capacity for Jackson Public Schools to be able to use this land for community improvement and development in this lake is huge. It is a massive opportunity. And look, I don't want to badmouth Entergy. I think there are people of goodwill there who are trying to do the right thing. But it certainly would help to have private sector folks to come along and say, to this major utility company that has made a lot of money off the people of Mississippi and the people of Jackson. It also got pushed into an agreement to refund money on utility bills this summer to people. Look, there are ways here that you can really come around and do the right thing and benefit a community that you've benefited so much from over the years.
Director Patterson, this is actually a really good opportunity for me to invite you to say more about the Chisholm Legacy Project, because what I'm hearing, honestly, is that your organization is the kind of bridge we need between frontline communities and overlooked communities and the highly technical aspects of a great deal of this work around climate change and sustainability. Your work, as you've just outlined around public utilities, is indicative of that. Feel free to let our audience know anything you'd like about the Legacy Project and its pathway forward.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so the Chisholm Legacy Project, super briefly, it has 4 kind of foci of the work that we do. One is community building. So, and with a real emphasis on working with those very communities that I talked about after the first question, the communities that are the most disenfranchised, so unincorporated areas, areas that don't have any other organization or institution working with them. Like, those are the communities that we are prioritizing, because we want to make sure that those communities are move into self-determination. 2 is movement building. So there is this movement of folks out there, and our work around at the intersection of Black liberation and just transition really means that we're working with the National Black Workers Center to help them to center climate justice. We're working with the Climate Justice Alliance to help them to do better with addressing anti-Black racism. So we're really working with movements to help to strengthen those various aspects at that particular intersection. 3 is bending the mainstream arc towards equity and justice. And so this is where I work with the private sector, with even large environmental organizations, large philanthropy organizations, to understand what it looks like to really serve these communities that need these groups to work in service to their leadership. And so we're helping to do that bridge work. So whether it's working with FERC on helping them to develop those pathways through the Office of Public Participation, or it's serving on the board of Ceres and working with, as they develop the principles and processes around equity, racial justice, and climate justice, et cetera, or working with groups like the American Society of Adaptation Professionals and helping them to understand what racial justice looks like in the context of climate adaptation. And then our 4th bucket is around Black femme well-being, recognizing that there's humans at the center of all of this work, and some are bearing more burden than others in doing the work. So working on wellness, which is just as important as working on improving the utility business model. So that's in a nutshell our 4 foci.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Director Patterson. And again, welcome to the Ceres board. Dr. Luckett, Director Patterson, again, it's an honor to have you here in this conversation.
Thank you, Richard.
This will bring us to a wrap of today's session. Director Patterson, Dr. Luckett, we are so very grateful to you for joining us today and for broadening our perspective on this historic act and for sharing your call to actions that we should all be listening deeply to. Thank you so much for your time today.